All right. So welcome everyone to today's webinar on home lending and real estate law. I want to introduce some of the panelists to you really briefly, just so you know who's here. So my name is Jamie Blau. I'm with Next Step New York Real Estate. I'm a real estate agent in sales and leasing. My co-host today, Sharon Cantor. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Jamie.
How are you?
Good. How are
Good.
you?
I'm good. Sharon is an agent as well with us on our team. And I have Stephane Zwirn, Zwirn Law, PLLC. Hi, Stephanie.
Hey, Jamie.
Hey. And Sal Skolnick from Bank of America. Hi, Sal.
Good morning.
Sal is a mortgage banker. So we'll get started. Thank you for everyone for coming. We hope to bring you some amazing content today. Everyone's industries and businesses have sort of shifted. So we're excited to tell you what's going on in our industry, in the real estate world. For me to get deals done, the most important people are my lawyers and bankers. So I'm excited to have them here. Just to, go over briefly, real estate transactions in New York City are challenging enough as they are. Right now, it's still happening. They're challenging, but definitely not impossible. I'm seeing everybody be super creative to get deals done. And that's what it's all about, is creativity and just working together to make sure that we can move all the pieces through as best as possible. A couple of numbers I thought I would share with everyone today. So current activity, which is down, current active listings are 5,068, so 5,068. Contract signed currently, also down, but also very slowly closing out, 4,368. Current off-market listings, this is interesting, 4,826. So we're almost as many off market as we are on market, which is at 5,068. And then we don't know how much. The unknown number is what's waiting to list. That will be, once I think things calm down, more people will want to list. But new monthly supply over the last 10 years, March and April are almost half of what normal March and Aprils are. And that makes sense. I mean, we are going through a pandemic, so this is a crisis, and people are, not listing as much. We still want to see people list, because once we get through this, which we will, the floodgates will open and we're going to have pent up supply and demand. So I just want to go over a couple of those numbers with you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. But I want to go and start our program. Sharon, would you like to introduce our first panelist?
Would love to. Thanks, Jamie. So we're going to first discuss law with Stephane Zwirn. She has provided legal services for over 28 years to a diverse range of individuals and businesses for sales, purchases, and lease of properties. She focuses on her large firm expertise with boutique firm client service, and is grounded in landlord-tenant law and real estate transactions. She has had offices in Mexico City and in New York. She's admitted to practice law in New York, the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Court of International Trade. She's a negotiation specialist and has been an adjunct professor of law for contract drafting. She's a legal mentor for the Harlem Educational Activities Fund and a member of the National Association of Female Executives.
Great, thank you so much. Stephanie, welcome. Thanks for coming here and being with us virtually.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Sharon.
We appreciate it. So let's get into it. Tell me, there's a difference, like what I was just alluding to. We have to be creative. We have to work a little bit harder probably to get things done, to get deals through the door. How was due diligence before and how is due diligence now? Can you walk us through that process?
Yeah, Jamie, thank you. That's a really good question. There's definitely differences. I think in our crowd today, we have people who are real estate agents, brokers, and also buyers and sellers. So I want to address the basics. and then also talk about the differences and the pitfalls that we find with COVID, that we find generally, and then as related to COVID. I would say it starts out with due diligence, which is the beginning of the transaction, and then it also is affected at the closing. So I'm going to reference both of those. Due diligence happens as soon as I get the deal sheet. Due diligence is when I'm representing the purchaser. So I'm representing the purchaser, I get the deal sheet, and I'm right on it. The first thing I want to do is I want to review the minutes of the board of directors meetings. We're talking about co-ops and condos. In New York City primarily. And generally what happens is I would immediately call the managing agent or the co-op directly and schedule an appointment to review minutes. And that's because minutes of the board of directors meetings are proprietary to that particular co-op, which means, as far as I'm concerned, I can't just call them and say, hey, can you please send me the minutes? Because I'm not allowed to have them. I'm allowed to review them because it facilitates the transaction for the co-op and all the parties. So it's great for me to be able to do it, but they're not going to just give it to me. So normally I would make an appointment and I would go in and I would review the minutes of the board of directors meetings. With COVID, with the pandemic going on, there's not a place for me to be able to go and review the minutes. So that creates a whole host. The minutes are really important to the due diligence process for my purchasers because it explains what's going on in the building. I review the past 2 years because there's always a lot of stuff that might be going on prior, or it also tells a story that leads us to the minutes, address things that are financial and humane to the building. It can address whether you have a salsa dancer living above you who's dancing at 4 a.m. with her heels without the required 80% carpeting. And that's something you want to know for your quality of life. Are there smells that are coming next door or whatever? You would see that in the minutes if there were complaints. But also, very importantly, it might talk about if they want to increase the maintenance or if there's litigation going on in the building. So there's lots of things. If they need to do major repairs, where's the money coming from? So all of those things are listed in the minutes, and that's why it's really important for us to be able to see them. Janie, you can stop me and interject at any time because I could go on forever about this. Okay?
Well, I always say to clients, that this is a huge and very important part of the process, of the buying process, because they have questions that sometimes get answered in the minutes,
Yes.
and we want to hear that. What color tulips they're planting in the minutes versus the salsa dancer. But those things all get addressed, and you want to hear what the building's really chatting about behind the scenes. So
Right.
It's a very important part of the process.
Right. So what happens though with COVID is that I can't get in to review the minutes. So now I have to get really creative, and I have to be tenacious to get this done for my client, because the goal is to get it done really thoroughly, and as quickly as possible. So now figure I can't get in to review the minutes. One thing that I did is I have a very, very comprehensive questionnaire. And if I send that to the first thing I ask the management company then, if I can't get in, is how much do you charge for your questionnaire? I pay by credit card, or I'll put my running shoes on and I'll get it over to the management company, because they're not going to review my questionnaire until they have the money. So I send them an incredibly detailed questionnaire. I've been doing this for 28 years. So I know what questions I need answered in there for the most part. Nothing's going to be perfect during the pandemic, but for the most part, I send an incredibly detailed questionnaire to the co-op that they have to answer in writing, and they send it to me, and we can rely on those answers as opposed to, let's just say, a quick telephone call asking questions. I like it much better if it's in writing. There's something to rely on if we need to. That's one way. And then another way, REBNY told the co-ops that they're allowed to actually send us the minutes by email, but we would do it with an agreement, like a non-disclosure agreement with the co-op, that as soon as we're finished with these minutes, we're not going to disclose them to anybody, we're going to trash them, and that still maintains the integrity of what is proprietary to the co-op. So those are two ways that I would address getting through the minutes part of the due diligence.
And that's completely new and different from how you would ever normally do it, right? Like you would never normally.
No, normally we get the deal sheet and we make the appointment to review the minutes at the co-op or at the managing agent. A lot of times I pride myself on being a sprinter. I've been a competitive runner for 44 years, and I bring that into my practice. So I do things quickly, but really efficiently. So usually we go there, and now we can't go there. So what are ways that we're going to do it differently? Very thorough questionnaire, or if the managing agent or co-op will allow us to actually receive the minutes. That's kind of iffy. Even though REBNY says we can do it, Real Estate Board of New York, it doesn't mean that the co-op is willing to follow it. So what I do is I get that questionnaire, that very thorough questionnaire out right away. And then I try to see if I can actually get the minutes, because that's the more thorough way. Another part of due diligence is the financials. I get the last 2 years financials of the building. And as brilliant as I may be with numbers, I am no CPA, and I don't claim to be. So I'll review those minutes, but I also send them to my CPA to review. And I get a review of those. I send it to my client. By the way, I don't only send this due diligence information to my clients, I send them to the brokers and agents that I work with as well, because we're a team. We operate on that pyramid mentality, and we might be over here, but we all have the same goal. And I want the brokers and agents I work with to not only have the information for this particular deal, but if they're ever going to sell or represent purchasers in that building, again, they'll have a wealth of information and they can work quickly in that realm.
Well, agents love attorneys that are fast, that will run to the finish line, and will give us the information too, so that we have it. It's important for us to understand it as well. So that's great that you do that.
With the financials, one of the pitfalls, well, the financials, just very quickly and generally, will give us a lot of information about how the building is doing financially, not just in this moment, but if they have any past bills that have to be paid in the future. If the building has a mortgage, how are they paying it? How are they considering refinancing? So a lot of really important information in there. So the CPA reviews it, but one of the pitfalls I found, I've been working with the same accountant who's been reviewing the purchasers, my purchasers' financials for 18 years. And she's excellent. She gives a great review. But during tax season, I always have somebody that I know very, very well. He's a real estate consultant, and he's also an accountant from one of the big accounting firms. And he'll review it for me if it's during tax season, because I know that's when she's going to be more compromised with her time. So during COVID, she's even more compromised with her time, because it's not only tax season, but she's dealing with the PPPs and all the applications. So I have people in place in case one can't review the financials, somebody else can, because again, we got to get through the due diligence very efficiently. Another part of due diligence, I don't think any other attorney does this that I know. If you guys do, let me know. But there's a book, it's called The Offering Plan. It's about 500 to 1,000 pages. It's filed with the Attorney General and has a lot of details about the building in it. If it's an old building, a lot of those details are not really relevant about how the building or the co-op or condo was formed. But it's very important to review that risk assessment memo and any amendments that have come up to date, because there's very important details in there. The most important ones I see, the bylaws are in there, the house rules are in there, reference to any potential flip taxes in there. If it's a co-op, the proprietary lease is in there. And again, to go really basic, when you're buying a house or a condo, you get a deed that evidences your property. But when you're buying a co-op, you're buying shares of stock in a corporation, and you can't live in that piece of paper. So you have a proprietary lease that's an agreement between you and the co-op that allows you to live there. And so the details of that are really important. So I prepare a risk assessment memo based on the offering plan that details the particular risks with buying in that building. And that's very, very important for my clients. And then the last thing I have is that questionnaire. So the questionnaire, generally, it's sent to the co-op right away. But in the case of COVID, if we don't have those minutes to look at, we now want the questionnaire to be incredibly detailed. We need those answers right away. I do sprint through this process with a lot of diligence to give a lot of information to my clients, so that while it's happening while negotiating the contract, so that and it should not take more than a week. And once the contract is fully negotiated, and my client's already had all this information and it's asked me a billion questions on it, they can sign the contract. And that's how we get through due diligence during COVID. Great. And if anybody has any questions, please shoot them out.
Yes, please use the Q&A box so that we can answer your questions in real time. We'll be monitoring that. So that's great. What about, can we transition, Stephanie, into closings? What's going on with closings? You know, I think that's the big question right now. What are you seeing on your end?
Okay, great question. So now we've gotten through due diligence and, well, okay, so what has to happen in the meantime before we can get to the closing are a few things. You need your board approvals. So we need our brokers to be able to make the application to the board, schedule the interview. That interview could be impacted by COVID. They're not going to do it in person anymore. So it could be by Skype or Zoom or however they're going to have those interviews. And one thing that's really important is to stay on top of the managing agent, stay on top of the co-op to make sure that they're reviewing it timely and the application's in timely, they're reviewing it and you get interviewed timely. And that's, I take that upon myself and the entire team to really push through it to make sure it's happening timely, because otherwise it'll sit there. So that's a challenge. Something that's also a challenge, and I'm sure that Sal's going to address this when he's speaking, is the appraisal. One of the pitfalls that I found is if I have a deal that was made before COVID and now the appraisal's being done now, well, the value has dropped in the property likely, and so the appraisal might come in lower. So what's a way that I can address that? I've been addressing it. If it comes in short, I had a deal recently where it came in $25,000 short. The parties agreed to split it. I try to come from a philosophy of share the loss on this because we want, the goal is for our clients to be closing in the best possible circumstance, and everybody recognizes what COVID's costed us. So in this particular circumstance, we amended the contract, and they shared the loss, and we were able to move through that. And also the co-ops have an incentive. This is the way I look at it, for the co-ops to want to help us get through this and not stay away from the transaction, is that they have an incentive. If the building has a flip tax, it's an incentive for them. They'll get more transfer fees if they could do more things in their building. And everybody's going to be at a financial loss on this. This is a way to get the co-op to have money. And also it'll prevent their own shareholders and owners from being in default. They might need to sell. So it helps them to be able to sell, get the new person in that has the money to be paying regularly. So there's an incentive for that. So once we get to once we have board approval or the waiver from the condo and the loan is clear to close from the bank, we're ready to close. What's a pitfall that's happened is that people aren't having in-person closings anymore. So there's really two kinds of closings. We can close in escrow. And I have to say that make sure that your attorney is connected to a stellar title company. I know that Sal and I work with a particular title company that's amazing, and it's with Assured. And you have to be working with somebody who's going to really work with you, because for the closings, the title companies have become even more vital, even if it's just for a co-op. They've stepped into the shoes with virtual notarization, which is a big hurdle for us, and they can notarize documents virtually, which is great. I have one title company that actually went to my purchasing client's house to make sure that the title that the closing was effected properly. What I like to do personally with my transactions is I like to have the documents not signed virtually necessarily. They can be notarized virtually, but I like to have the documents overnighted to my clients. I can review it with them, and then they can sign it and overnight it back to me. The title company holds the money. Once the title company gets all of the signed documents, they're holding the money in escrow. And once they have everything they need, they disperse the money. I like doing it that way because then we have original signed documents, and money's held in escrow and wire transfers, and it's done effectively. I have to say overall, there's definitely transactions happening. They seem to be happening slower. So it's really important that your team is extremely diligent, almost tenacious, to make sure that everybody's on the same place and making things happen quickly. Let me just see if that was it. Oh, the only other thing that I would say is the walkthrough when we're closing. And that's what the brokers and agents, it might be done virtually. And the only thing that I would say is to make sure that when you're going to contract and you're signing a contract, most contracts in New York are, the apartments are sold in their as-is condition, which means it's in the same condition that it's in on the day you sign the contract. It has to be in that condition on the day that you close. Except most people don't sign the contract at the last moment that they saw it. So there's a timing issue there, and it's really important when you go to look at the apartment, take a lot of pictures, be very thorough if you're going to make an offer on this apartment. Look under the rug, make sure that the water gets hot, make sure the windows open and close, and take photographs so that when you get to the walkthrough part of it, right before you close, it's very thorough and there's no questions that need to be asked. Any
Fantastic.
questions?
We do have some
We
questions.
do have some questions. Going back a little bit, Stephanie, to the conversation about the minutes, does Revenue also permit the minutes to be sent to the brokers and the agents via the attorney?
No. No. Okay, so if we're going to remember, the minutes are proprietary to the co-op. They don't want to share them, and they don't have to share them. They're actually not allowed to share them. But Revenue's made this exception. As far as I know, in order for me to get the minutes from the co-op or the condo, I have to be able to sign a non-disclosure. Saying that I'm not going to share it with anybody else. If I'm actually at the managing agent's office reviewing minutes, there's been some managing agents, if they ever saw me taking pictures of the minutes with my phone, I'd be thrown out of there. And my relationship with the managing agent is so vital to me being able to get things from my client to move it quickly. Some managing agents won't even allow me to use my computer when I'm in there to take notes, and I have to do it by hand, which is quite antiquated and slow. So giving them to anybody else outside of my office, I would imagine, is completely not allowed.
Thank you very much. And one more question that came in for you is, in terms of reviewing the offering plans, how long does that usually take? How much time do you need to spend to review that?
Yeah, it took like 500 to 1,000 pages, and then there could be like 25 amendments. It's a very long document. So it easily takes hours. And I will say that I also know what to look for. If it's a building that was created, a co-op that was created, let's say in 1986, there's a lot of information in there that's not as vital. And then the amendments become much more important. But again, the most important documents in there to me are the proprietary lease, the bylaws, the house rules, and make sure that they're all updated. And then there's a lot of other information that I need to find in there as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Any tips, tricks, and pitfalls to look out for that we should be aware of?
I think that I went over those. I think right now, particularly with COVID, let's just see, aside from appraisals, something in the contract, and this is contractual, so it's from a legal perspective, but it's so important for all of us to make sure it's in the contracts, is a clause, it's called force majeure. And it translates from French into major force. I don't speak French, but I know that. And it's basically referencing anything that is sort of a force of nature, like a pandemic, that causes us to not be able to perform in the contract the way that we would expect to be. And it needs to be it should be in the contracts anyway, because let's just say, I mean, we all experienced with 9/11 terrorism, and something like terrorism is something that could impact your ability to act in the contract the way that you want. And COVID-19 was never considered part of force majeure, but now it is. I think on March 11th, the WHO made statements that made it that a pandemic can be included in a force majeure clause. But if your contract does not have a force majeure clause in it, which it really should, but if it doesn't, there's also doctrines that can be followed that can protect the purchasers and the sellers as well. Let's see, impracticability of performance. So that would be for something unforeseeable. Let's say a person died. It would be impracticable for them to be able to perform the contract, right? So that idea now comes into play with the pandemic as well. There's another doctrine that we could look to called frustration of purpose. Let's just say if somebody gets, and here's actually an important distinction. If somebody got sick from COVID, but they're still alive and they're still okay enough, let's just say, I don't want to make judgments about people's health, but with frustration of purpose, they might not be able to close within the time contracted for, the timeline in the contract. But that wouldn't necessarily be a reason to cancel a contract. It would be a reason for you to postpone the contract. And one thing that's not considered in these doctrines is if you have a loss of money. So loss of money wouldn't be a reason, like let's say the appraisal came in low on the apartment, that wouldn't necessarily be a reason in these doctrines to pull out of the deal. It would, if they lost some money on it, they'd still be expected to go through, or if there was a time clause that they wouldn't be able to meet, you might extend the time out to close.
Stephanie, do you see contracts moving forward getting tightened up a lot more because of like having force majeure added in when really it might not have been included as much up until now?
That's a really good point. Absolutely. And there's also, you'll see in the contract that there's going to be sort of like the COVID clause. You know, if you look to the purchaser or seller's rider, probably their last clause, because it was just added in, will be a COVID clause to protect the parties.
It's going to be interesting to see when we get through this, which we will, what's going to change our industry. You know, I think these Zoom calls and being able to connect virtually is going to stick. That's my theory. But I also think that being able to do things, you use the word antiquated. I'm hoping and I'm wondering if management companies and the way that we did business before are going to update a little bit.
What I hope that updates that I've always said, and our closings in New York are so onerous. There's really no reason for us to need to be physically present at the closing table. So many people don't need to be there. And also, Saul, I love banks, but the amount of paper that comes from the banks at a closing, I've actually seen them really be much more reduced, but hopefully we can sign things on a more virtual basis and not have to, or electronically, and not have to sign with paper. And I have to shout out to Saul because he's absolutely fantastic. You're going to hear him speak soon, and he's got a big heart and he's incredibly thorough. So I look forward to it. And also for Jamie and Sharon, you guys have been amazing to work with. Jamie's helped me with things that are certainly not necessary, and she still steps in and helps in a major way. So thank you to this entire team that's here. Stellar.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, your wishes are our command. We're going to get this all right now. So, Sharon, you want to go ahead and introduce him?
Yes, absolutely. We're going to now talk to Saul Skolnick. He is an NMLS certified residential mortgage originator and CMPS mortgage planner with Bank of America Home Lending. He's located in New York, tri-state area. He provides mortgages, HELOCs in all 50 states and DC. He's also an author, a photographer, and his work has focused on civics, history, and finance. Thank you, Saul, for joining us.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Stephanie, for the lovely words.
Welcome, Saul. Thank you for joining us. So,
morning, Jamie.
Hi there.
Hi.
You better call Saul. It's a very easy way to remember Saul. Okay, so Saul's with Bank of America. We want to just go into the lending part of this. Why don't we start with purchases?
Okay.
Since Stephanie did a good job of due diligence and contracts. Let's go to purchases.
But Stephanie also alluded to an important point. Everybody is adjusting in terms of how to take care of the appraisals. We have, for many of our products, allowed for drive-by appraisals, outside appraisals, all kinds of looking at algorithms from different things that we subscribe to come to a value if for some reason there is absolutely no way for an appraiser to get into a home. So we've made adjustments where we can. It will depend on the kind of mortgage because Fannie and Freddie have rules that might be different than the individual bank. When you're talking about a loan that's going to be in our portfolio or Chase's portfolio, there may be ways for us to be a little bit more broad than Fannie and Freddie might be. So that will have some impact on it. But we're all working to figure out a way to keep it safe, but keep it financially smart. The other things, sorry?
No, I was going to say, I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions for you as well. So just as a reminder for people to use the Q&A box so that we can answer them live with Saul here. So go ahead.
Then also on the purchase side, the banks are evaluating risk every day, several hundred times a day in terms of different areas potentially being of less value than they are now. There are banks who, even before COVID, at the beginning of this year, thought they were going to be softening markets in certain parts of Connecticut in our geography and move their loan to values lower than they had been in the past. So each of the banks is looking at that sort of area by area, geography by geography. There's no right reason, no right answer, no wrong answer, but everybody's being as careful as possible. However, on the good side is you can upload your documents, you can do the application without ever leaving your car if you wanted to, or without ever leaving your home. That was already in place for a lot of banks. It has now been accelerated. Somebody can apply for a pre-approval without ever speaking to me if that's what they really wanted to do, although I love to speak to them. But all of those things are now in place. You can upload documents from virtually anywhere and we can accept them. So that, again, was part of the way the business was going in general, but has been accelerated, scrutinized, and modified to be as workable as possible because of COVID.
So are banks still, we're still doing business? You're essential, right? Banks are essential. So
yeah, I mean, many of the banks have their branches open, but certainly all of the back offices are open. We work round the clock on residential. I will say that our partners elsewhere in the bank working with PPP have moved underwriters over, moved all kinds of people over in order to be able to respond to that. Just as a quick aside, in a normal year, Bank of America's small business area probably gets about 70,000 individual applications. They fielded 300,000 applications in the first 7 days of PPP.
wow.
So you can, the magnitude was there, and they moved a lot of people doing things that they didn't know that they were going to be able to do.
That explains why it's been tough to, taking a little bit long to get through.
Absolutely. Although I will say for most of the banks, if you go to their website, they've been very good now about indicating which link is for residential, which link is for PP, which link is for a credit card, which is, if you need whatever service you need. They're trying very hard for people to be as little frustration as possible, understanding that frustration is in the air no matter what.
Great.
We have a couple of questions that have popped up, if I can ask them. Saul, would Bank of America offer SBA loans to real estate brokers?
That's from our business point of view. I don't have the expertise to answer that question, but they certainly, I can, if we find out who asked the question, I can get them in contact with somebody at SBA at Bank of America who does those loans.
Great, that would be wonderful. And another question that came up is, what is the leadership team at Bank of America saying about the mortgage industry?
They're saying that we're enfranchising it. I mean, it's active. We have been hiring. We're still hiring people. We've moved people around. We've allowed people to work remotely. We've done all kinds of things to adapt. But there are people coming on board as we speak. Certainly, Bank of America is in the business in a big way, and we're all assuming that real estate continues to be a dominant part of our economy when the dust clears.
Wonderful. So what about, let's transition into, what are some of the products that you're offering people who already own a home and are struggling financially?
One of the things I want to say about people who need help, who are already in a home and who have a mortgage in place, our bank and many of the other banks have put programs in place to be able to defer the payments. Now, each bank and each note is going to be handled differently. So the generality is there are programs that can postpone the payment for 30, 60, or 90 days. And then there are many programs, and just to put in one plug for Bank of America, one of the programs we have is that you can put the mortgage, that part of the mortgage that you can't pay now, at the very end of the note, so that your 360-month loan becomes a 363 or a 366-month loan. There's not a balloon being inserted there. But again, it's going to be specific to each bank. It will often be specific to the product, because as folks in the business know, many of those notes are in the hands of investors, even if a bank is servicing them, and investors have different requirements, rules, and regulations. Most of them didn't anticipate this kind of a pivot, but they're, for the most part, they're trying very hard to figure out a way to make it easy. Nobody in our business, and through all the people I've spoken to, want to see anything that resembles what happened 10 years ago in terms of people being displaced, in terms of people not being able to hold on to their homes. The first thing the banks went out to do was to say, if you can pay, if you need help, and again, if you're not paying now and going to pay later or paying delayed on a short balloon, it's not going to show up in your credit report. The banks have been very clear that once they understand that you need this help, it's not a 30, 60, or 90-day late. That whole phraseology has gone away if they know you need the help. If you don't tell them and you forget to pay, that's a different story. But if you're in conversation and they're all trying very, very hard to make sure there are people there to have those conversations, you're going to be in much better shape.
The biggest thing is the conversations. Even on a tenant side, landlords are saying, it's okay. We can work something out for you, but you have to have the conversation with us. So it's same goes for, tenants that are renting, but that payment is still going to be owed. And I think that, even with mortgage or with rent, if you shift that payment a little bit and you move it to the end of your mortgage cycle, or you don't pay it now as if it's concerning rent, you still will owe it. So that's a big important thing that, I think people say, oh, I don't have to pay my rent now, but they do eventually. Yes.
I just want to interject about
Please.
the rent issue. Just yesterday, a report had come out that for the month of April, in the 90s, mid 90s, was the percentage of what people paid their rent in full. Which was shocking because everybody thought they weren't paying their rent, but people had paid their rent for the month of April. However, and therefore the landlords weren't very negotiable as far as forgiving an amount of money. You will still owe it later on. So Jamie's absolutely correct. I'm curious to see what's going to happen in May with such high unemployment of people being able to pay their rent. And then I think the government will have to step in at that point, or suggestions, regulations, whatever it is, to give tenants some sort of relief, because right now they're not being offered any relief. Some relief, no eviction, that kind of thing, but they're still going to owe that entire chunk of money. And I'm always concerned about moving, let's say 3 months of rent that they have to pay at some point later on when they're just trying to get back on their feet. So I'm really looking forward to some assistance being offered to the tenants on that.
Right. And I think what they're trying to do is amortize that over the course of the rest of, a lease or a year, right? Or a year of the lease. So it'll still be owed. And that's the biggest key takeaway is if you can pay your rent, if you can pay your mortgage, you should still do that. It's a better situation for you. But obviously, we're all going through this crisis together, and there are a lot of options. And, you should take advantage of it if you do need that.
Right. Good point, Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
I was going to go back to your original product question because
Yes, please.
I wanted to simply say there are different kinds of refinances. For those people that want to simply lower what they're paying, it's still an opportune moment for what we call a rate and term, which lowers your monthly payment. Rates remain low. They're going to remain in this trough for the foreseeable future. Simply because interest rates are going to be held in check for as long as possible. Also, in terms of the appraisals, if you're appraising 90 days in the rear view, the values that were gotten 90 days ago will in general be as good or better than they're going to be going forward. So if you're looking to look at your equity for a rate and term refinance or a cash out refinance where you need to extract money from it, this is an opportune moment. And the banks are willing and able to do that in a quick process. Of course, in the New York metro area, we build in a longer free lock because we understand that when it comes to condos, co-ops, and things in New York, they just take longer because they do. So there's that understanding as well. For those locks where people can't get to the closing because of something to do with COVID, although there's no rule, as you will, the banks have been very, very flexible in extending those locks when necessary, understanding that if somebody can't get out of the house or something can't be taken care of, nobody's trying to be punitive. We're all trying to work together to get that done without additional cost where it's possible. The other thing I was going to say is people who need money often look to their properties for equity, home equity lines of credit for those people who already have a mortgage, or for people who want to be able to take money, repay it, take money, repay it for up to 10 years are available. There are still lots of banks offering them. It's a much briefer process than the regular mortgage because all of the basic mortgage information is in place. So that's something that people should consider rather than going to their credit card, for argument's sake, at 20-odd%. The home equity line of credit rates are based against prime, and we all know that prime has come down to 3.25 because it's pegged directly to the federal rate, which is at almost zero. It's the only rate that really does impact mortgage product directly in a way that everybody can see.
So it might be completely obvious, but are you seeing, what kind of spike are you seeing in HELOCs and, the mortgage rates and things like that? Like, are you getting a lot of calls with people who already own and
Yes.
are looking to, great.
Yeah, we're writing proportionally more HELOCs than almost anything else at this point where people have equity. And again, because Bank of America is a national bank and because everybody is helping everybody else, I've been writing in HELOCs for places elsewhere in the country I've never even heard of. So my perspective on what homes are worth and how people see the value of their homes and what money means has been, really, it's been eye-opening in a very positive way.
Fantastic. We have some questions.
Definitely have a couple of questions here. Saul, moving forward, is there any chatter of the banks adding pandemic clauses to their commitments for loan docs and everything?
I'm not quite sure in other words, to extend the period of time, or I'm not quite sure what it means.
I'm assuming that it means in maybe the initial mortgage commitment.
Yeah. Well, the commitments, we've extended commitments where necessary if people can't get to closing when they thought they would. And I don't think that anybody's going to incorporate clauses in a blanket way. I think we're all trying to figure out what will make things work now and what is going to make things work a week from now. Because it's fluid.
I think that where that's going to stick is going to be in the contract of sale.
Actually, I was going to just interject on that, Saul. When somebody's taking out a mortgage, a 15 or 30-year mortgage, that's so long-term. But when you're talking about the contract, it's really for, like, let's say a 90-day period. And that's really where the protections are going to be. I think that for Saul, for the banks, it needs to be much more long-term. So might not address the pandemic in the long term in 30 years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Steph.
We had some other questions, I believe. Sharon?
Yep, we do. What if your bank states they no longer give investor loans for co-ops and you cannot refinance for a lower rate?
Well, if your bank can't do it, you have to find a lender who can. I mean, banks are businesses and they make business decisions that move in time. So there are banks who have, in the past couple of months, decided not to do home equity lines of credit anymore. There are ones who will not do cash out refinances unless they already own the note. And it's going to be bank by bank. But if a lender can't help you, there are lots of lenders. It's still a competitive business. Somebody will be able to talk to you about it.
Thank you.
I love this other question that we have. What will happen for first-time home buyers if they're currently a tenant and they're not able to pay their rent? What will happen down the road when they're ready to buy? How will they qualify?
If they've worked out a program with their landlord that the landlord will honor in terms of when they're asked about their past performance and saying, they had a difficult time, we allow them to not pay at that moment. I think banks expect that. Again, I don't know what 100% what the underwriter is going to say and how it's going to be handled because we're going to be going forward. But my sense is at the moment, everybody's going to look at things anew where they can. And yes, if you couldn't pay for 3 months because you were out of work, but you got your job back or you were unable to pay all of it, and the landlord is working with you, they're working with you the same way as we're working with mortgage holders, and we're not holding it against them. We're not putting it on their credit report because we understand that it's not because of unwillingness.
Great. Well, that's very good to know. I think the big thing is it's the future that we're trying to predict of what's going to happen, and there's no history on that. So it's a good question. We have another, in addition to the SBA loan question. It seems like many banks, you need to have a previous account with them in order to get that SBA loan.
Again,
are there banks, is Bank of America?
Yeah. No, Bank of America has asked for people who have businesses with Bank of America, business accounts. They've been the first ones that they've responded to because they're already an existing relationship. But I don't feel comfortable speaking to what we do for other things or what other people do because that really is a very separate part of the business, and I'm not qualified to give an opinion.
Right.
And I don't have the facts.
Yes, we'll certainly, that's a good question for CPA or, yeah, I'm getting yes from Stephanie. Okay, so I don't know if we have any other questions. Sharon?
We just got another question in the chat box. How will the underwriting look at self-employed borrowers, knowing that the gross receipts have dropped off significantly and might not get back to normal until 2021?
I can only assume in this case that it will be on a case-by-case basis, and that banks are very good at looking at longer-term history, so that, again, we're all going through something together. If there was a pattern of growth that has been clearly interrupted by the pandemic or by the geography because of the pandemic, I'm guessing that banks will have their underwriters look at that and go one-to-one to find a way to work with it. That would be my estimation of how it will be perceived.
And we have another question.
One additional question just popped up. How do you predict, what do you predict happening to the rates over the next 3 to 24 months?
I predict that nobody in their right mind will predict them. Listen, the rates are going to stay low at the moment. We know from all the conversation out of the Federal Reserve and everywhere else that the government has been going to borrow a huge amount of money. It's going to be in the interest of the country for those rates to be kept low, and the echo will be through the mortgage business. So my guess is they will stay in the current range for the foreseeable future. And when everybody is healthy again, somebody will revise that in about an hour and a half.
That's great.
Thank
well,
you.
if we could all predict the future, I would be buying a lot of real estate now, probably, because I'm sure 10 years down the line, everything will go up. So, so thank you all for being here, for being a part of this. Oh, we have another question for Stephanie.
So Stephanie, if co-ops don't allow move-ins right now, what do we do if the other side pushes to close regardless? Oh, she's muted. You're muted, sir.
Got it. Okay, that's an excellent question, and I just done this because there's a few other issues we can address. I think we have a few more minutes, right?
Yes,
Jamie?
absolutely, and please keep questions coming in so that we can get to them.
And also, if you guys have any questions afterwards, I've included below my picture my email, my telephone number, and you can contact me anytime with any questions you might have after this. But just read the question one more time so that I can get the detail of it, if you can, Jamie.
Yes. Let me pull that back up. The question was, if co-ops do not allow move-ins right now, what do we do if the other side is pushing to close regardless?
Right. So that was one of the things that I was going to bring up is if in order to make the sale happen, let's say I had a client who needed to sell and the purchaser was just being slow, and this is pre-COVID days. I would send a time is of the essence notice to the purchaser's attorney. And a time is of the essence notice by the courts is recognized that I can force the sale anytime between 2 weeks to 30 days. That's considered reasonable. So most attorneys will say 30 days just to make sure that they're staying within the timeline. That's and in order to send a time is of the essence notice, it's really important that your attorney makes sure that his client, that the seller, is actually ready, willing, and able to close. And especially during the days of COVID, if there's something that's going to stop them from being able to close that they're not foreseeing in the next 30 days, and they've sent a time is of the essence notice, now they're in default. Now they're in violation. So you have to be very careful when you're sending a time is of the essence notice. These days with COVID, what's different is that these timelines are going to be more gently construed. So let's say there's a clause in the contract that was prior COVID that said that the closing had to happen within 30 days of board approval and the loan being clear to close. That should be looked at much more gently. There's not as much forcing as going on. So in particular reference to your question, if you have a scenario where the purchaser is being pressured to close by the seller, and let's just say that the co-op is not allowing move-ins, well, then they can't move in. One thing that I consider sometimes is pre and post closing possession agreements. If we have a scenario where the seller can't move out, let's say. If the purchaser can't move in, the seller likely can't move out. So let's say that's going on, but we want to get the closing complete. We could do something that's called a post-closing possession agreement. And it's an agreement between the parties that it would allow the seller to stay in the premises until it's, practicable for them to be able to move out. So in other words, when the restriction is lifted, then they'll move out. And usually what happens financially with that circumstance is that the seller would cover, let's say, the mortgage and carrying costs of the apartment for the purchaser while that's going on. A scenario where you do a pre-closing possession agreement, that's where the purchaser would move into the apartment before you close. That's, well, first of all, if you can't move in and move out during COVID, that can't happen. But under normal circumstances, I don't really recommend it unless it's absolutely necessary, because most co-ops don't want it. They don't want somebody moving in if they haven't yet been board approved and closed, because if something goes wrong, now the co-op and the seller have to try and get this person out of the apartment. So for COVID in particular, if the seller's pressuring them to close, you can consider closing, but the seller would have to stay in the premises and handle the carrying costs.
These are all really great questions, because, if you have deals on the table, we're seeing, the creativity. This is where the creativity part comes in, is how, if both sides want to make this happen, and, it's possible. You can close. It's just levels of creativity that were not in play before COVID to get the deals done. Like you were saying, Stephanie, might be paying a mortgage and maintenance costs for, a certain amount of time. There's, other things that people are doing, but there's, what's interesting is just, you have to be both on the same page. That's, and wanting and ready and willing and able to move forward. The ready, willing, and able part is, the move in and move out. And, I'm just wondering if now that we're approaching May, if we're going to see more buildings open it up, because you're going to have a lot of buyers and sellers that are going to be in distress if we cannot get them to move faster, right?
Well, that's even when I referenced that it could be it could be to the benefit of the co-op to allow them to be able to close and move in whatever safe way they can. Safety first. But again, if the co-op's not allowing these transactions to close, the co-op is losing money, whether it's through maintenance from a seller who can't afford it or through their flip tax. So it's in everybody's best interest to be able to get to close in the safest way possible. I actually had a question for Saul, if that's okay.
Please.
If someone loses their job, under normal circumstances, that would be a reason not to fund the loan, right? What happens during COVID? What's a way that it can be addressed?
At the moment, it's really being handled case by case. It really depends on what the loss is, what it looks like, what the language is of the person not being currently employed, where income is coming from. So each of those things is being looked at on a case by case basis, as is often the case in the best underwriting. Yes, there are general guidelines, but people are people and they have different situations. So I think now more than ever, that's the lens that's being used.
Would you suggest maybe one way to make it happen, because that's our job, make it happen in the safest way possible, is that the person who lost their job, maybe they can get a guarantor for a certain period of time until they prove that they're capable, like they've gotten their job back and they have regular income? Absolutely.
We call it, in the current parlance is now a non-occupying co-borrower, because people use other words, and so yes, that exists. And if the person who is there as your co-borrower is able to take care of the loan for you and on paper and willing to sign on to it, we have the ability to do that in regular times. Certainly haven't lost the ability to do that in these times. Great idea. Thanks, Stephanie.
And do you also see that it's possible that once the primary, the resident, the occupant of the apartment has their job back and they're more established, and you can see that their finances are solid, could that guarantor, non-occupying guarantor, be let off of the mortgage? Does that ever happen?
I don't think that can happen, although without a refinance. I mean, because it's the nature of the note. The note's been signed and that person is responsible until they're not.
Thanks, Saul.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We have a few more questions.
Yes, we have a couple more questions for you, Stephanie. Have you found that boards are holding back on approvals because move-ins aren't being allowed?
I don't find that they're holding back on, it's so hard with the co-op to find the reason for what they're doing, as you know. It's so done in the dark corners, the deep depths. But, that could be one reason, not why they're not making the decision, but why they're moving slowly. What I find is that the co-ops don't have a sense of urgency to move, which, like I said, runs counter to their interest to get money in for the co-op. But that not being able to move in and out could be a reason to not have a fire lit underneath them to actually review documents. I do find that the co-ops are moving slower, which is unfortunate, but that's when it becomes my job to not just send emails and follow-up emails, but to pick up the phone and speak to somebody. I find in the days of COVID that really goes a long way, is that personal contact, and to make sure that you're working with people that have relationships with these buildings as well, because that goes so far.
Excellent.
Jamie, one of the questions
yes.
that you sort of asked before, there's actually a correlative to it that just occurred to me that's important, having to do with if you're not paying rent. If you're currently in forbearance with your mortgage and it's not an issue, but the bank has given that to you, you cannot refinance that note. If you're not able to pay the current note, the bank's not going to allow you to refinance that note. So that's something that has come up recently with the forbearance, and it's not meant to be punitive. If you don't have the money to pay what you're paying, they're not in a position to recreate the note until they know where you're going to be. That has come up a few times early on in the process, when people called in and asking if they could refinance, even though they couldn't pay their current mortgage.
Very interesting. Yeah. Stephanie?
No, I was just saying that was a great point. Thanks, Saul.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Excuse me, I'm going to say thank you to everybody for joining us. And I'm so excited to have brought some of my experts to you today. If there are any other questions, and maybe Saul and Stephanie, if you want to throw your information into the chat box while we're still online, this way people can grab that information directly right now. But if you do have any other questions, any follow-up questions, we're happy to answer them offline. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate you all coming, and I hope this has been informative. It's always interesting to hear what everybody is up to in their own individual areas of our real estate sphere here. Thanks. Take care, everyone. See you soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Good night.